If you invested $10,000 back in 1990, you'd have $190,000 today, even after taxes and management costs. And if you'd invested 15 years before, you'd have $1.4 million. dollars. Those types of returns is why investing is considered one of the most powerful ways to increase your wealth. But there's one really important question that needs to be answered, which is, will it continue? Now, last I checked, nobody can see the future. But in general, the expectation is that, yes, the stock market will never stop growing. People disagree on how much it will increase by over what period of time, but over the long run, the stock market is expected to grow. So, why is that? Well, there are four forces that drive the stock market upward. These are known as the four sources of economic growth. Now, before I get into these four sources of economic growth, I want to make it absolutely clear that economic growth is not the same as the stock market increasing in value. When I was studying economics in college, one of my professors had a saying that I really liked. He would say, Wall Street is not the same as Main Street. What he meant is that the types of companies traded on the stock market are not always a great indication of how healthy an economy is. While these large publicly traded companies are an important part of the economy, so are the small businesses that make up towns and cities. But if you're trying to increase your wealth through investing, you probably care about the companies that you could actually invest in through the stock market. And these companies are dependent on the four sources of economic growth, just like any other business. So let's get into it. So, what are these sources of growth that keep driving the stock market upward? Well, the first one is land, or natural resources. Since the very beginning, us humans have been reliant on nature for the resources we need to survive. The most obvious of these is food, which is still a massive component of our economy. But food isn't the only useful resource. Lumber, oil, and minerals are all important economic products. Of course, the available land on Earth isn't actually increasing. As oceans rise, it will actually decrease a little bit. So, how does land contribute to economic growth? Well, there are two different ways. The simplest is to just develop more land, which is pretty obvious. We might not be getting a new land, but we haven't made full use of the land that we have. I remember taking road trips across Nebraska on my way to college, and it seemed like every square inch was cornfields. But there is still some land that hasn't been developed. And with underwater farming and mining becoming more and more popular, we could effectively create new land. The second approach doesn't require new land, but just more effective land use. The yield on farming has increased massively as new techniques have been discovered, and the same goes for other forms of production. The next source of economic growth is actually the one that's most interesting to me. Let me tell you why. We just talked about land as a potential resource, which is technically fixed. But there's a lot of land left to develop, and one day we may even use other planets and moons. But the second source of economic growth is actually shrinking, at least in many places of the world. That's because the second source of economic growth is labor. Humans can do a lot of things that add value, whether that's manual labor or using our mind. But the world population is expected to peak within this century, and in many places of the world is already decreasing. So if you can't add more workers to the workforce, how is labor a source of economic growth? Well, one option is to increase the number of hours worked, but this isn't a super popular trend. Another option, just like with land, is to increase the productivity of the resource. And this is where a ton of innovation has happened. From the invention of early assembly lines to the creation of ChatGPT, we've found a tremendous number of ways to increase our ability to do work. That means even countries with relatively small populations, like Taiwan, can have an absolutely massive economic output. That comes from high education and hyper specialization. To enable workers to increase their productivity, we often have to leverage the third source of economic growth at the same time. This third source of economic growth is capital. Capital refers to all of the goods that aren't sold to end consumers. Instead, capital is used to create other goods. For example, a garbage company might have a fleet of garbage trucks. This is their capital. And a car manufacturer might have thousands of tools on an assembly line. These are also capital goods. Governments also invest very heavily in capital. That's because some things, like roads and bridges, aren't very profitable for a company to build themselves. This is where the government steps in. It might be very useful for an economy to have a network of interstates, but that won't be profitable for any one company to build. The government can use taxes to build public capital to help grow an economy. Hopefully, the benefit to the economy is greater than the cost of the taxes. And finally, the last source of economic growth is probably the most exciting, and also probably the one that people most often think about. The last source of economic growth is innovation. Innovation refers to the organization of other resources, land, labor, and capital, into new things of value. This can be anything. Crop rotation was an innovation in farming. Assembly lines were an innovation in how to create cars, and agile development was an innovative way to manage projects. Personally, I think one of the most exciting opportunities in the future is the ability of AI to innovate for us and bring new knowledge and insights to cause even more economic growth. But even without AI, people are always building on the ideas of others. This innovation is a constant driver of economic growth. So, as long as economic growth occurs, you'd expect companies to become more valuable. And as long as companies are becoming more valuable, the stock market will continue to go up. Since I'm counting on my investments to reach and maintain financial freedom, it's really important to me that this economic growth continues. And it's really important for the world too. Since 1990, the percentage of the world's population living in extreme poverty has gone from 36% to just 12%. That's a massive accomplishment, which has been enabled by economic growth. But there are still 750 million people living in extreme poverty, and they're counting on economic growth to make the world a better place for them and their children. So, economic growth isn't just about living a more luxurious or financially free life. It really is about the betterment of humanity. Fortunately, for both my personal finances and the quality of life for the billions of inhabitants of planet Earth, the four sources of economic growth are still alive and well. That means the stock market will never stop growing, and people's lives will continue to get better. So I'm pretty confident that the stock market will continue to grow, but an important question is just how powerful is investing? Well, I made a video on that topic, which I'll link right here. If that video isn't linked yet, it means you probably need to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to make sure you see it when it actually posts. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.